Mayor Walsh is trying to provide new protections for renters faced with displacement. His proposal would specify grounds for eviction and give tenants more information about their legal rights. There would also be a new effort to gather information and shape housing policy in the future. To explain the measure is our guest, the Deputy Director in the Department of Neighborhood Development and also the new head of the Office of Housing Stability, Lydia Edwards. Thank you very much for being with us, Lydia.
Thank you so much for having me.
We have heard anecdotally that the prices of housing are going through the roof. Lots of people are getting displaced.
Right.
But other than that, do we really know that much about what's going on?
Well, you're right. A lot of what we have is through stories, through people telling, through people calling the city and saying, I can't afford to be here. But we do have some data, but unfortunately it's usually after a year. So the data we are getting based on eviction records, based on landlord-tenant records, really shows that there are people who are being evicted for non-payment of rent, and many of them just can't afford the higher rents.
Well, why is it important to get more details on this?
Well, because if we're going to come up with policy, first let me just back up, right? Mayor Walsh is committed to making sure that all people in Boston feel that this can and will remain their home. Working folks and working families who have been here for generations are finding it harder and harder to stay here. And so this whole entire effort is part of a larger movement by Mayor Walsh to assure that we come up with a sustainable city, all right? And so what we're trying to do then is come up with policies to help us achieve that goal. And that means we need to know what's going on in real-time data, and that's why the data is so important. You know, if it's just a matter of an average of, $500 rent increases are preventing people from being able to stay in the house, in their homes, how do we respond to that? If it's really an uptick in the amount of people who are having issues with housing conditions, I mean, we really need to see what is going on as it's going on. Finding out about it in an aggregate a year later is helpful. But it doesn't really help us get to the moment and really assure that tenants know their rights at that time.
Talk about the importance of knowing rights. How can that make a difference?
Well, 80% of evictions never actually go to court. Now think about that. That's usually all evictions start with a notice to quit. That's by law. So they're sending out the notice to the tenants saying, unfortunately your tenancy shall or should end, and they're informing them why they want the tenancy to end. It doesn't mean that they did anything wrong, but a lot of people don't know that. And a lot of people don't know that it just started there, it doesn't end there. And so many people give up. Many people assume that this is going to happen to me. And I think a lot of people also are already shell-shocked. I mean, you think about it, some people have fallen behind in rent because they lost their jobs, because they suffered in a divorce. So someone is already dealing with a trauma in their life, and then this is added to that. So what is important is that they understand that they can pull back and that there are resources and there are rights and there's knowledge that they can have to allow for them to take a little bit more control and really steer towards their own future that they can hopefully control. That's what we're trying to do, is to bring them back to the table and saying that you have a voice and you have rights. That's
We're talking with Lydia Edwards from the Department of Neighborhood Development. What about the just cause evictions, the different grounds that this ordinance, that this petition, home rule petition, would spell out? What's the importance of being very specific about what those are?
Well, it's important because we want to make sure that that tenants are not just thrown out for no reason. You should explain and be very clear about why someone is going to lose their house. And that's really kind of the clarity, which is so important. Also, if you're alleging something, I can actually respond to that, saying, well, actually, no, I did pay, or I didn't, or I only paid a certain amount because of certain reasons. That alleged illegal activity, I actually didn't do it. I didn't permit it to happen. I mean, it allows me to actually know what's going on. If it's just because I want you to get out, and I'm clearing out a building, then there's no response to that. And we think when it comes to housing, there should always be able to be an opportunity to really try to save your house.
Now, of course, what's also important about this measure is which owners it applies to. Right. Please explain that.
Well, it applies to owners of 7 units or more in the city of Boston. So this would be a home rule petition. So the city of Boston will file with the city council. City council needs to pass it, and then it needs to go to the state house. So it would still take another 2 years probably before the actual law is implemented. But that's very important. And actually, there's a very small percentage of landlords who have 7 units or more in the city of Boston.
You know, I'm also worried that some owners who might control maybe even dozens of units of property in the city might skirt this, because if they put each of those properties under a different legal entity, couldn't it be hard to figure out really who they are?
Well, the law is written so that it defines landlord no matter what form you put yourself, right? But you know, you're right. If there's someone who's intending to try and skirt the law, they can feel free to try and skirt the law, but it's a matter of numbers, not the names on the property. So how many do you actually own?
Now, back when this measure was going through different stages before the city council, the property owners groups were out there. They were vociferous against this. They said, you know, if you put more roadblocks in front of our ability to control property, then you're going to be getting less housing supply. I mean, what would you say to that?
I think that there is a concern that when it comes to the table in the future of Boston, a lot of property owners are concerned that they're not going to be there. I think that that's where that's coming from. And the reason why we have the Office of Housing Stability and have mediation services at the Office of Housing Stability, and why we're dedicated to assuring that people can stay here, is because we believe firmly that all landlords and tenants should have a place to stay in Boston. So I'll just say that. In terms of their concerns, we met with them many times on the draft. I mean, the reason why it changed significantly was because of their feedback. So I think that they should be not so concerned. I don't think that they're going to have to worry about us trying to do anything nefarious against them. We are just trying to ensure that tenants know their rights, and 80% of evictions actually happen due to non-payment of rent. That's the top reason why you can actually evict someone under this statute. So a lot of their rights and all of their rights are basically retained. You know, I think that unfortunately a lot of people are just concerned that any move towards tenants knowing their rights might be a move towards rent control or preventing people from being able to buy property in the city, and that's just simply not what we're interested in. We're just trying to make sure people understand what's going on.
Now, of course, another concern here, I guess, is that instead of just being told that your lease is not going to be renewed, or being told less formally that you need to move, what about people who actually do get evicted? I mean, talk about the burden that is for them if they're looking for new housing or even new jobs. Right.
No, I think that's what I alluded to a little bit before, right? If you have already faced the shell shock of maybe losing your job and then now are about to lose your home, what the city is trying to do is get to you before you're out of that home. That's why it's so important that we know who is facing an eviction. We can provide resources to them. There's certain funds that are available to many of them, and if it's just a matter of back rent, right? There's services that we're willing to provide, mediation, and also housing search, also that we're willing to provide. And if we can get somebody upstream enough to help them provide those resources, together we can navigate this difficult time and make sure that they get over this part. But if we end up finding the person at the courthouse, which is what oftentimes happens, or they come to us after they've just lost their eviction case, it's much harder to respond.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for the time.
Lydia Edwards from the Department of Neighborhood Development. In a moment, we'll hear about a new tax credit to increase support for community development.